All sinful human beings, that is, all human beings, have fallen short of the glory of God and thus bring daily dishonor to God, and therefore are under the wrath of God righteously. It is just of God to pour out His wrath upon people who are sinners and bring daily dishonor to Him. Nevertheless, it is possible, because of what God provided in Jesus Christ, His only Son, for sinners under the wrath of God to be set right with God because of Jesus by faith alone. That's the point of the book of Romans. Paul's answer to the greatest human problem in the world, namely the sinful guilt of all humans before a holy God, is that God Himself provided a righteousness, not our own, a righteousness which He would credit to or impute to us if we would trust Christ and receive it as our treasure. We call it justification. Paul calls it justification. By grace alone, through faith alone, on the basis of the work of Christ alone, for the glory of God alone. That's the main point of the book of Romans. Look at chapter 4, verses 5 and 6. I want you to see it from his own lips. He's the one who's inspired. I'm a pointer. Romans 4, 5 and 6. But to the one who does not work, but believes, there's faith, not work, but believes Him who justifies, sets right with God, justifies the ungodly, his faith is credited as righteousness. Verse 6, just as David also speaks of a blessing on the man to whom God credits righteousness apart from works. Notice that enormously important word, credits. This is where we get the doctrine of imputation. Another word for credit is reckon or count or impute. So let's notice the two things that he says. They're a little different, but they wind up saying the same thing. Verse 5 at the end, faith is credited, counted, reckoned, imputed as righteousness. End of verse 6, God credits righteousness apart from works. In verse 5, faith is focused, and in verse 6, righteousness is focus. Righteousness is being credited in one, faith is being credited as righteousness in the other. What does that mean? This is the glorious gospel truth that God provides a righteousness that is not our righteousness and then counts that righteousness through faith to be our righteousness. So when you read in verse 6, He credits righteousness to us apart from works. That's the same as saying He credits faith as righteousness, because faith is the instrument or the channel through which that righteousness is credited to us. Now here's the question to fill out the gospel. Whose righteousness is it? If you die this afternoon, awesome thought to face the judge this afternoon. No more church services to go to, no more books to read, no more tracts to ponder, no more radio programs, just Jesus, the judge of the universe. Infinite, flaming in holiness. What's your claim going to be? You're a sinner. There's not a righteous person in this room. Everybody in this room is ungodly, sinful, bringing disrepute upon Jesus every day and probably every hour of every day by virtue of falling short of loving God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. So what are you going to say? Whose righteousness will commend you to God? That's a really important question. And the gospel in the book of Romans is written to reveal to you the answer to that question. Let's read it, chapter 3, verse 21. But now apart from the law, the righteousness of God, there's your answer, has been manifested, being witnessed by the law and the prophets, namely, the righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ for all who believe. So a righteousness is manifested now in history, and it comes to you not to damn you, but to save you through faith in Jesus Christ. But let's be more specific. Chapter 10, verse 3. If you want to go there with me, you can see it. Not knowing about God's righteousness that was just referred to in 3:21 and 22. Not knowing about God's righteousness and seeking therefore to establish their own. Don't do that. After this moment, you should not be ignorant and therefore should not fall into a self-righteousness effort. You can't do it. There is no righteousness you can ever perform that will commend you to Him. Forget that. Don't make the mistake of chapter 10, verse 3. Being ignorant, not knowing the righteousness of God, they sought to establish their own and did not subject themselves to the righteousness of God. What does that mean? What does that look like? Right there in your pew, right now, how are you doing that? Or are you? Are you subjecting yourself right now to the righteousness of your own? Or are you construing your attendance in this room as the establishment of a righteousness which will get the smile of God on your side? What is the subjection to the righteousness of God? Don't make up an answer. Get it from the Bible. It's in verse 4. Because, or for, I'm going to give a very literal rendering of this now. It's so important, I think, to get this exactly the way Paul wrote it. For the end or the goal, don't think it matters too much whether you take it as end or goal here, of the law is Christ for righteousness to everyone who believes. That's the literal word for word translation. For the end or the goal of the law is Christ for righteousness. For whom? To whom? Believers. So if you ask now, what does it mean to subject yourself to the righteousness of God in verse 3? Answer, the law that you're all trying to keep to establish your own righteousness. He's talking to somebody who's doing that. You're all trying to keep this law and establish your righteousness. Don't you understand? The law, the goal, the telos, the end of the law is Christ for righteousness. How? Through belief. So the subjecting of yourself to the righteousness of God is the recognition that God's righteousness is Christ for righteousness. Christ worked out our righteousness. Christ is the manifestation of God's righteousness. Christ is the performance of God's righteousness. And the law is pointing to that. That's the goal. That's the end. So when you look at the law, be sure you don't fixate there and begin to use it to establish your righteousness. Let it point you to what it's all about. Christ for righteousness. And then how do you get that? For everyone who, finish it, believes.